It wasn't the touch. There was no moment I could point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It was quieter than that. It was the pleasure of being noticed, the way it lingered after everything was over, the way it stayed with me when I went back home. That's what changed me. I'm in a committed relationship, a normal one, stable, respectful, built on routine and trust. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't looking for excitement, validation, or a way out. I wasn't chasing trouble. What happened didn't come from intention. It came from a moment where I felt seen in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. There was no touch, no explicit line crossed, but there was a reaction inside me that didn't fade when the moment ended. And what unsettled me wasn't that it happened. It was how it stayed with me afterward. The pleasure wasn't physical. It was internal, subtle, quiet, and impossible to ignore. That's when I realized this wasn't about what others could see. It was about what I carried with me long after. Do you think pleasure without touch can still cross a line? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this make you question your own boundaries, subscribe and share this story with someone who understands how complicated real life can be. What stayed with me wasn't a moment I could replay clearly. That's what made it confusing. There was no single scene, no image I could freeze and analyze. It was more like a feeling that settled in quietly and refused to leave. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a reaction, just my ego responding to attention. I said all the right things in my head to keep it contained. Everyone likes to feel noticed. This doesn't mean anything. It will pass. But it didn't. What surprised me most was how normal everything looked on the outside. I went back to my routine. I laughed at the same jokes. I showed up where I was supposed to. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was fine, and I would have believed it. Yet internally, something had shifted just enough to make me feel off balance. The pleasure wasn't intense. It wasn't overwhelming. It was subtle, which somehow made it more dangerous. It showed up in small ways. How I replayed a conversation later. How I noticed my mood lifting when I thought about being seen that way. How I felt a quiet warmth that didn't belong anywhere else in my life. And that's when the guilt started. Not because I had done something I could confess, but because I couldn't explain why I felt the way I did without sounding ridiculous or dishonest. How do you admit that nothing happened, yet something changed? How do you justify feeling affected by something you claim doesn't matter? I tried to push it away. I distracted myself. I focused on everything else. Work, responsibilities, routines. But the feeling kept resurfacing. Usually when I was alone and unguarded, late at night, in moments of silence, in the space where excuses don't work as well. What scared me was realizing I didn't want to analyze it too closely. Part of me preferred not to name it, not to examine it, because naming it would mean taking responsibility for it, and responsibility would mean making choices I wasn't ready to face. I wasn't fantasizing, I wasn't planning anything, but I was carrying something private, something I hadn't earned the right to keep to myself, and that contradiction sat heavily with me. I remember thinking, if this feeling never comes back, I'll forget it. But another part of me wondered what it meant that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to. That's when I understood this wasn't about temptation in the obvious sense. It was about how easily pleasure can exist without permission, and how quietly it can test who you think you are. Do you think a feeling can already be a boundary crossed, even when no action follows? What made everything heavier was how quiet the pleasure was. It didn't demand attention. It didn't interrupt my day in obvious ways. It slipped into the background of my thoughts and stayed there, like a low hum I couldn't turn off. I would be doing something ordinary, washing dishes, answering emails, sitting in traffic, and suddenly I'd feel it again. Not vividly, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that something inside me had reacted, and that reaction hadn't been resolved. I kept asking myself why it mattered so much. I wasn't deprived. I wasn't lonely in the way people usually mean it. My relationship wasn't falling apart. We talked. We shared space. We made plans. From the outside, nothing was missing. That's what made it uncomfortable to admit that something internal had responded so strongly to such a small moment. I started questioning my own narrative. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I was overthinking, that I was giving meaning to something that didn't deserve it. And for short stretches, that worked. I'd feel grounded again. Rational. certain that I was still in control. But then the feeling would return, softer this time, more familiar. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind did. A slight warmth, a subtle lift in my mood, a sense of being awake in a way I hadn't consciously missed. And every time it happened, I felt a flicker of guilt immediately after. My body had responded without asking my values for permission. That disconnect bothered me deeply, because I've always believed that who we are is reflected in how we respond, not just what we do. And here I was, responding in a way I didn't recognize, or at least didn't want to recognize. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't dramatic. It was restrained, contained, and that almost made it feel justified. I told myself that as long as I didn't act on it, I was still being loyal. That thought became my anchor. I held onto it tightly, repeating it whenever the guilt threatened to surface too strongly. No touch, no action, no betrayal, but something about that logic felt thin, because loyalty isn't just about restraint. It's also about where you allow pleasure to settle, about what you give space to grow inside you. And I had to admit, even reluctantly, that I had given this feeling space. I didn't talk about it with anyone. Not friends, not my partner, not even myself. Fully, I kept it compartmentalized, sealed off, telling myself it would fade on its own. That time would dull it. That silence would neutralize it. Instead, silence seemed to preserve it. The longer I avoided naming what I felt, the more power it seemed to have over me. It wasn't getting stronger, but it wasn't disappearing either. It existed in this unresolved state, and that unresolved state started to affect how I saw myself. I began wondering if the real issue wasn't the pleasure itself, but my unwillingness to confront it honestly, whether avoiding the discomfort of clarity was already a choice, and not a neutral one. And once that thought settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the beginning of something that would eventually demand a response, whether I was ready or not. Because feelings you refuse to face don't simply vanish, they wait. Do you think avoiding a feeling gives it more control over you than acknowledging it ever could? What unsettled me most wasn't that the feeling stayed. It was that I began adjusting myself around it. Not in ways anyone else could notice. Not in ways I could easily explain. But internally, I started making space for it. Small allowances I didn't want to admit were choices. I became more aware of when it might resurface, more conscious of moments that could trigger it. And instead of actively shutting those moments down, I found myself simply not interfering. That realization hit me slowly, then all at once. I wasn't chasing the feeling, but I also wasn't protecting myself from it. I was letting it exist in this quiet middle ground, convincing myself that neutrality meant safety, that as long as I stayed still, nothing could tip over. But stillness isn't the same as control. I noticed how my thoughts had changed tone. They weren't explicit or intentional, but they lingered longer than they should have. I replayed conversations in my head, not because of what was said, but because of how I felt while they were happening. That sense of being seen, of being noticed without effort, of being present in someone else's awareness in a way that felt immediate and unfiltered. And always afterward came the guilt. It wasn't sharp. It didn't stop me in my tracks. It showed up quietly, like a weight I carried without fully acknowledging it. I felt it when my partner trusted me without hesitation, when they spoke openly, comfortably, assuming we were fully aligned. I felt it in those moments because I knew I was holding something back. Not an action, but a truth about my internal state. I kept telling myself that honesty would only complicate things, that explaining this would cause unnecessary pain, that I was protecting the relationship by managing it privately. And for a while, that explanation felt convincing. But then I started to feel distant in ways I couldn't justify. Not colder, not disconnected, just slightly removed, like I was half a step behind my own life, observing rather than fully participating. I laughed at the right moments. I responded appropriately, but part of me was elsewhere, monitoring a feeling I hadn't resolved. That's when I realized how deceptive internal boundaries can be. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, I had begun dividing my attention, and attention is a form of investment, whether we admit it or not. You can't repeatedly return to a feeling without giving it something to grow on. I asked myself whether this was just a phase, whether time alone would dissolve it, whether I was giving too much meaning to something that would eventually fade if I stopped feeding it mentally. But the truth I kept avoiding was simple and uncomfortable. I wasn't just waiting for the feeling to disappear. I was waiting to see what it would turn into. That scared me. Because waiting without intention isn't passive. It's postponement. And postponement slowly shifts responsibility from the present moment to some imagined future where decisions will somehow be easier. I started wondering how many people cross lines not because they want to, but because they delay choosing not to. And that thought stayed with me longer than the pleasure ever did. At this point, do you think not choosing was already a choice? The shift became impossible to ignore when it started changing how I behaved, not just how I felt. It wasn't obvious. No one would have called it suspicious. But I noticed the effort it took to stay normal. I was more aware of my reactions, more cautious with my expressions, more careful about where my mind went when I wasn't busy. That constant self-monitoring drained me in ways I hadn't expected. I started feeling tired for reasons I couldn't explain. Not physically, emotionally. I was carrying an extra layer of awareness everywhere I went. I wasn't lying, but I was filtering. I wasn't hiding actions, but I was guarding my inner world closely. And guarding something all the time creates distance, whether you intend it or not. I caught myself responding automatically instead of openly. I listened. I answered. I participated. But something in me stayed slightly restrained. Not because my partner did anything wrong, but because I didn't want to risk being asked questions I wasn't ready to answer honestly. That's when the guilt changed again. It stopped being about the pleasure itself and started being about fairness, about the imbalance I had created without consent. My partner was showing up fully, trusting that we were on the same emotional page. I wasn't. And even though nothing wrong had happened, that imbalance felt heavier than any single mistake. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that feelings don't always mean something, that I could ride it out quietly until it passed. But the more I tried to suppress it, the more present it became, like something resisting being ignored. I remember one ordinary moment that stayed with me. We were sitting together, talking about something trivial, and I felt this sudden wave of sadness. Not because of the conversation, but because I realized how much I valued what we had, and how reckless it felt to be risking it internally without addressing the cause. That contradiction broke something open in me. I wasn't choosing between two people. I was choosing between comfort and integrity. And I hated that it didn't feel obvious, because part of me still wanted to believe that silence was the responsible option. That speaking up would create damage where none existed. That managing it privately was the mature thing to do. But another part of me, the part that had started feeling distant, knew that silence was no longer neutral. Silence had become a strategy, and strategies always serve someone. I began to see that by avoiding discomfort, I was protecting myself from accountability while slowly eroding the honesty my relationship depended on. Not through betrayal, but through avoidance. And avoidance, I realized, has its own consequences, even if they arrive quietly. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't before. If I kept going like this, the story wouldn't end cleanly. It wouldn't explode. It would fade. Trust, closeness, self-respect. One subtle adjustment at a time. And suddenly, doing nothing felt riskier than doing something. Do you think protecting a relationship by staying silent can actually damage it more in the long run? By the time I reached this point, the pleasure itself was no longer the center of the problem. What took its place was tension. A constant, low-level tension that followed me through my days, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. It showed up in moments where I should have felt relaxed, in conversations that should have felt easy, in silences that suddenly felt heavier than they used to. I realized I was no longer reacting to the original feeling. I was reacting to the fact that I had never resolved it. That's when I started noticing how much energy I was spending just to stay aligned with the version of myself I wanted to believe in. I was constantly reminding myself who I was supposed to be, what I stood for, what mattered to me. And the fact that I had to remind myself so often felt like a warning sign I couldn't ignore anymore. I caught myself comparing emotional states, which scared me more than any comparison between people ever could. I noticed how calm I felt in certain moments, versus how restless I felt in others. How easily my mind drifted back to the same feeling I claimed wasn't important. How quickly I shut that drift down, only to feel it return later, unchanged. That back and forth wore me down. I wasn't living in crisis. I was living in suspension. And suspension, I learned, is exhausting in its own way. You're never fully at peace, but never fully confronted either, just hovering in between, hoping time will solve what courage hasn't. At home, I started feeling something close to shame, but not the kind that makes you hide, the kind that makes you look inward and feel disappointed. Not in what you've done, but in how long you've avoided doing what you know is right. I kept thinking about how trust actually works, not in theory, but in practice. Trust isn't just believing your partner won't betray you physically. It's believing they're emotionally present, honest, and aligned with the life you're building together. And I had to face the fact that, in a quiet way, I had stepped slightly out of alignment. That realization hurt more than guilt ever had, because guilt can be rationalized, discomfort can be avoided, but misalignment sits there, undeniable, asking to be addressed. I asked myself what would happen if I continued like this for months, for years. If I kept telling myself that as long as nothing escalated, everything was fine. I pictured a future where this unresolved tension slowly turned into distance, resentment, or regret, not because of one mistake, but because of many small delays. And I didn't like that version of myself. I didn't like the idea of becoming someone who avoids difficult truths just because they're inconvenient. Someone who lets feelings exist unchecked, simply because confronting them requires courage. Someone who waits for a situation to resolve itself, instead of taking responsibility for it. That's when it became clear that the real risk wasn't temptation. The real risk was postponement. Every day I waited, I was choosing comfort over clarity. And that choice, repeated often enough, starts to define who you are, whether you want it to or not. I hadn't crossed a visible line, but I was standing close enough to it that I could feel the consequences already. And for the first time, I understood that sooner or later, I would have to choose, to step back deliberately, or to keep pretending that standing still wasn't movement at all. Do you think delaying a hard decision can change who you become, even if nothing bad ever happens? The moment it started affecting how I interacted with other people, I knew I had waited too long. Again, nothing obvious happened. No slip, no comment I couldn't explain away. But I felt it in the way my attention fractured. I was no longer fully present in conversations. Part of my mind was always checking itself, monitoring reactions, asking questions I shouldn't have needed to ask if everything was truly under control. I began noticing how often I pulled myself back, mid-thought. I'd be about to say something honest, something real about how I was feeling, and I'd stop. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt risky. Risky to reveal confusion, risky to admit I wasn't as settled as I appeared. That hesitation became familiar, and familiarity made it dangerous. What troubled me most was how reasonable everything sounded in my head. I wasn't lying. I wasn't deceiving anyone outright. I wasn't acting on impulse. I told myself that restraint was proof of character, that awareness was enough, that as long as I didn't cross a visible line, I was still doing the right thing. But slowly, that logic started to feel less like integrity and more like justification. I noticed it most around my partner. They trusted me completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just naturally. The kind of trust that comes from consistency and shared history. And every time I felt that trust, it weighed on me. Not because I had betrayed it, but because I knew I wasn't meeting it with the same openness anymore. I had become guarded, not cold, not distant in an obvious way, just slightly less available, less spontaneous, less willing to let my thoughts wander freely in conversation. I was editing myself before words even reached my mouth, and that constant internal filter created a quiet wall between us. One evening, my partner asked if I was okay. Nothing accusatory, nothing suspicious, just concern. I said yes, and the word came out too quickly. That's when it hit me. I had crossed into a space where honesty felt harder than denial, where telling the truth, even partially, felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I could close again. That realization scared me more than any temptation ever had. Because temptation tests desire, but avoidance tests character. I started wondering when exactly this had stopped being about pleasure and started being about fear. Fear of uncomfortable conversations. Fear of hurting someone without a clear reason. Fear of facing the possibility that I had allowed something internal to grow simply because it felt good to feel something unexpected. I didn't feel powerful anymore. I felt trapped by my own restraint. And the strangest part was this. I still hadn't done anything anyone could point to and call wrong. But I was living with the constant awareness that I was managing a secret, one made entirely of feelings, implications, and delayed decisions. That kind of secret doesn't explode. It corrodes. I began to see how easily this could continue indefinitely, how simple it would be to keep choosing silence, telling myself I was protecting the relationship while slowly draining it of authenticity. I saw how people end up far from who they intended to be, not through betrayal, but through repeated avoidance. And that scared me enough to finally admit something I'd been avoiding. I wasn't afraid of consequences anymore. I was afraid of becoming someone who never chose, because at this point, not choosing was already shaping me. Do you think fear of uncomfortable truth can quietly do more damage than a mistake ever could? The breaking point didn't feel like urgency. It felt like clarity. Not the kind that comes with relief, but the kind that strips away excuses. I woke up one morning with the uncomfortable sense that I already knew what I needed to do, and that every reason I had for delaying it was built on fear, not care. That realization sat with me all day. I went through my routine feeling strangely detached, like I was watching myself from a distance. Everything looked normal, but internally I felt exposed. Not to anyone else, just to myself. For the first time since this started, I stopped asking what if it fades and started asking what if it doesn't. That question changed everything, because if it didn't fade, then silence wasn't temporary anymore. It was a long-term strategy, and I didn't like what that said about me. I didn't like the idea of becoming someone who quietly negotiates her values instead of confronting them. I thought about how easy it would be to keep going like this, to let time pass, to keep things stable on the surface. No one would know. Nothing would explode. But I realized stability without honesty isn't stability. It's maintenance. And maintenance without alignment eventually fails. I started replaying moments not to relive pleasure, but to identify where I could have acted differently, where I could have stepped back sooner, where I chose comfort over clarity. That process wasn't gentle. It forced me to admit that while I didn't create the feeling, I had protected it longer than I should have. That's when the shame finally arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. It wasn't shame about desire. It was shame about delay, about knowing something mattered and choosing to wait instead of respond, about convincing myself that restraint was enough when what was actually needed was action. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I thought about my partner again, not abstractly, but specifically. About their trust, their openness, their assumption that we were moving through life on the same emotional track, and I had to face the truth that I had stepped off that track quietly, without asking whether it was fair to bring them with me later. That's when I understood something that surprised me. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to do. It was accepting that I should have decided sooner. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel resolved. I felt exposed and tired of carrying something that no longer belonged only to me. I knew that whatever I chose next would change the shape of things, but delaying it further would change me. So I stopped asking whether I could manage it internally. I stopped telling myself that silence was kindness. I stopped pretending that awareness alone was responsibility. I accepted that integrity doesn't wait for comfort. And once I accepted that, there was no neutral ground left. I hadn't spoken yet. I hadn't acted yet. But internally, the decision was already made. I was done postponing. Do you think realizing you waited too long is sometimes harder than making the wrong choice in the first place? Once the decision existed inside me, silence stopped feeling like an option, even before I broke it. Something shifted in how I moved through the world. I wasn't lighter. I wasn't relieved. I was more aware. Every interaction felt sharper, more deliberate. because I knew I was standing at the edge of a change I had chosen, not one that had been forced on me. What surprised me was how lonely that awareness felt. I couldn't share it yet. Not with my partner, not with anyone else. And carrying a decision you haven't voiced creates a strange kind of isolation. You're no longer undecided, but you're also not honest yet. You exist in between, committed internally, silent externally, and that space is uncomfortable in ways I hadn't expected. I started noticing how many opportunities I had to keep avoiding it. Moments where I could have stayed quiet and let things continue as they were. Conversations that drifted close to the truth and then moved away again. Each time that happened, I felt the weight of my choice pressing harder, reminding me that delay was no longer neutral. It was resistance. I also noticed something else, something harder to admit. The pleasure I had been managing so carefully had already lost its hold on me. Not because it disappeared, but because it had been replaced by something heavier. Responsibility. The awareness that what mattered now wasn't how I felt in those moments, but how I was going to live with myself afterward. That realization changed the emotional balance completely. What once felt tempting now felt small compared to the cost of continuing this quietly. I began to see the situation more clearly, without the fog of internal negotiation. And in that clarity, I understood how easily this could have gone further. Not because I wanted it to, but because I had underestimated how powerful unresolved feelings can be when left alone. I thought about how close I came to normalizing something that should have been addressed immediately, how easily I framed restraint as virtue, when what was missing was accountability. That recognition didn't feel like self-punishment. It felt like growing up emotionally in a way I hadn't expected to at this stage of my life. The hardest part was accepting that doing the right thing wouldn't undo what had already happened internally. I couldn't rewind the weeks of tension. I couldn't erase the moments of silence. I couldn't make the impact disappear just because I finally chose honesty. And yet, I knew that continuing to hide would only deepen that impact over time. I remember sitting alone, rehearsing not a speech, but a mindset. I wasn't planning to confess feelings dramatically or justify myself. I was preparing to take responsibility without asking to be understood immediately. That distinction mattered to me more than anything else. Because understanding can be requested, but accountability has to be offered. I knew that once I spoke, the story would no longer belong only to me. It would become shared, interpreted, questioned, processed by someone who hadn't chosen this tension, but would now have to live with its reality. That thought scared me. But what scared me more was the idea of staying silent now that I knew better. Staying silent after clarity doesn't protect anyone. It only preserves comfort for the person withholding the truth. And I had reached the point where preserving comfort felt dishonest. So I stopped waiting for the perfect moment. I stopped hoping circumstances would soften the impact. I accepted that the next step wouldn't feel clean or controlled. It would feel real. And once I accepted that, I knew there was no going back. Do you think choosing accountability changes a situation, even before a single word is spoken? When I finally spoke, it wasn't because I felt ready. It was because I understood that waiting for readiness had become another excuse. There was no perfect opening, no natural pause in the day that said now is the right time. I had to create the moment myself, and that alone made my chest tighten. I could feel my heart beating faster before I said anything. Not out of fear of being accused, but out of fear of being fully seen. I didn't start with details. I didn't start with explanations. I started with honesty. I said I had been carrying something internally that I hadn't addressed soon enough, that I hadn't acted on anything, but that I also hadn't been as present as I should have been. I admitted that there were feelings I didn't expect, and that I mishandled. Not through action, but through silence. Saying those words out loud felt heavier than I imagined. Not because they were dramatic, but because they removed the safety of ambiguity. Once spoken, the tension I'd been managing privately became something real, something shared. I could see the confusion immediately. Not anger, not accusation, just a quiet attempt to understand how something invisible could matter so much. That's when I realized how difficult this was to hear. From the outside, it probably sounded abstract. Hard to grasp. Hard to measure. I hadn't crossed a clear line. I hadn't broken trust in a way that left evidence. And yet, I was asking my partner to acknowledge an internal breach, one that existed without proof, without witnesses. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. I clarified what mattered most, that I wasn't confessing to relieve my guilt or to be reassured. I was speaking because I wanted to realign, because I didn't want distance to become normal, because I realized that silence had already started costing us something subtle but important. The conversation moved slowly. There were pauses I didn't rush to fill. Questions I answered carefully, without defensiveness. I didn't frame myself as a victim of circumstance. I didn't blame confusion or temptation. I owned my delay. I owned the fact that I should have addressed it sooner, even if it felt uncomfortable. What surprised me was how vulnerable my partner became in response. Not dramatic, not explosive, just honest in a way that made the weight of my choices clearer than any accusation could have. They spoke about trust not as a rule, but as a feeling, something built quietly over time, something easily shaken by distance, even when intentions are good. That was when the impact truly landed. I saw how my internal conflict had created space between us long before I said anything, how being guarded, distracted, and slightly withdrawn had been felt, even if it wasn't understood, and that realization hurt more than guilt ever had. There was no resolution in that moment, no neat conclusion, no reassurance that everything would be exactly the same. What there was, instead, was reality. Uncomfortable, uncertain, but honest. A shared awareness that something needed to be rebuilt deliberately, not assumed to be intact just because nothing dramatic had happened. When the conversation ended, I didn't feel lighter. I felt grounded. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. I wasn't managing a private narrative while living a public one. The tension had moved from silence into the open, where it could finally be addressed, even if doing so would take time. I understood then that honesty doesn't guarantee relief, but it does restore alignment. And alignment, I realized, matters more than comfort ever did. Do you think speaking up late can still rebuild trust? Or does timing matter more than intention? What came after wasn't closure. It was work. Not dramatic, emotional work, but slow, uncomfortable effort. The kind that doesn't give you immediate reassurance or clean endings. The kind that forces you to stay present, even when it would be easier to move on and pretend everything is fine again. We didn't rush to label what happened. There was no demand for certainty, no dramatic promises. What we did instead was acknowledge something that felt harder. Trust doesn't break only through actions. It stretches. It thins. And sometimes, it needs to be rebuilt, even when no one can point to a single moment where everything went wrong. I had to sit with the fact that my partner didn't owe me quick forgiveness just because I chose honesty eventually. Timing mattered. The delay mattered. And owning that without defending myself was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. What surprised me most was how much I learned about myself once the tension was out in the open. I realized that the pleasure I had fixated on wasn't about another person at all. It was about what it awakened in me. A need to feel seen, acknowledged, desired in ways I hadn't noticed were missing, not because my partner failed, but because I had stopped paying attention to myself. That insight didn't excuse my silence, but it explained it. And explanation, I learned, is not the same as justification. I had to confront the uncomfortable truth that boundaries aren't just about saying no to others. They're about being honest with yourself early enough to protect what matters. I waited too long to do that. And while I can't change the timing, I can change how I respond going forward. We chose to stay, not because it was easy, but because it was real. That choice came with conditions. More openness, fewer assumptions, and a willingness to talk about discomfort before it turns into distance. It also came with patience, because rebuilding trust doesn't follow a schedule, and healing doesn't respond to urgency. I don't tell this story because I think I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. I waited too long. I protected comfort when I should have chosen clarity. But I also didn't let the situation turn into something I couldn't stand behind. And that matters to me. What I carry now isn't shame. It's awareness. Awareness of how quietly things can drift. How easily pleasure can disguise itself as harmless. And how important it is to respond to internal signals before they demand consequences. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Loyalty isn't proven by never feeling tempted. It's proven by how honestly, and how quickly, you respond when you are. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories about relationships, temptation, and moral dilemmas, subscribe to the channel for more.